This is a short video on Patrick Lecture 187. It's a new lecture for September of 2024. And the lecture is titled How to Handle Alternation of Expansive and Contractive States. And when I read the lecture, I came upon, in a midsection of it, a description of 3 stages of consciousness. And I decided to put that first. So the week 1 study guide focuses on 3 stages of consciousness. Why? Because it helps us understand the rest of the lecture. And while I certainly respect the guide's decision to put it in the middle, I decided to put it first because I thought it would get people more acclimated to a certain perception. So the 3 stages of consciousness that the guide speaks of in this lecture are, he says, a little different than he has spoken of before. And the first stage is living in fantasy. Now, this is more prevalent than people realize. We live in fantasy anytime we are imagining outcomes that aren't related to the probability of what's actually going to happen. So that in our daily lives, when we have expectations and we rely on those expectations rather than listening for feedback about what we're actually going to get, we are to some degree living in fantasy. Now, the guide has this interesting description that helped me understand living in fantasy. And that is that the reason we do that is if we can't get pleasure in our reality, we resort to getting our emotional pleasure in the realm of fantasy. So one of the ways to identify if you live in fantasy for a short, brief period of time is that you go there to feel pleasure. So I'm in a difficult situation, and all of a sudden I start imagining how it could be different. Well, number one, I'm using my imagination to do that, but I've decided to go into a fantasy where there's no difficulty. Now, one person in today's group, because I'm speaking this solo, one person in today's group asked a great question, and they said, how does living in fantasy violate spiritual law? And for a moment, I was stumped. Now, I'm going to bring in the expansive and contractive states into this little section. I felt contracted. Oops, I don't have an answer. But that's not normally how I find answers, so I've trained myself to immediately relax and go into an acceptance. I don't have the answer. And then I said, give me a second. And then the answer came to me, but it came to me because I wasn't focused on being able to answer the question, having it at hand. It also came to me because the question, the answer to their question was, it violates all spiritual laws because fantasy doesn't have any rules that we don't control. The trick is that we control the rules of fantasy. Now, as an external example of that, when someone invents a fantasy, let's say a movie or a story about fantasy, they get to reinvent the laws of physics. They get to reinvent the laws of cause and effect. They get to reinvent all kinds of things. When we go into fantasy, without realizing, we are going into a world where we are omnipotent, where we are invisibly setting the rules. So how does that violate spiritual law? Tosses spiritual law out the window and says, my will, my desires replace spiritual law. There will be consequences, but only those that I can accept. There will be realities, but only those that I desire. So in effect, going into fantasy is a way of playing God. And that's how it violates spiritual law. My point in bringing that up is it helped me understand, just that question helped me understand living in fantasy and all its permutations. And when asked the question, I felt the contraction, oh, I won't have the answer. And then I felt the expansion of, that may be true. I may not have the answer. And then the flow of, oh, now I realize the question was actually so big. I was looking for something small, but the question was quite large. And that's an example of the expansive and contractive states. So how does 3 stages of consciousness interweave with expansion and contraction? In fantasy, we don't feel contracted because we're in charge. In real life, we may feel contracted. So this lecture is going to continue to discuss how to handle that alternation, where yes, you have to contract to move muscles, you have to contract to do things. So it's a contract, expand. Another question during the meeting, and this is why I do the videos after a few meetings, because the contributions from participants help me verbalize the lectures. I am inspired by the participants. Expansion and contraction can be felt in our own bodies. You can feel when you are contracted, but you can also misinterpret that. And here's an example where I misinterpreted expansion and contraction. I was reading an article on breath work, on body work and breath work. And the article basically said up is down and down is up. They said expanding my lungs was contraction. Well, I'd always thought of expansion is the inhale and contraction is the exhale. But this article described it differently, which was bizarre to me. And I had to think about it. I would think about the article, and then I would breathe, and I would notice, and I would think and notice, and back and forth until the light bulb went off. And I realized I understand what they're saying. Like a balloon, if a balloon is expanded, you have to blow into it. So there's a forcefulness. Force requires some contraction, some gathering of force and moving of force. But to let a balloon deflate, you just let go. You just unpinch the opening and it deflates. When I applied that to my own body, I realized that, yes, I can inhale and exhale in a relaxed state, but taking an inhale requires action. And once I have fully inhaled, exhaling only requires that I release, I let go. And that's why I understand that the energetic perception of breath work is different from what I had, my perception of what is expansion versus what is contraction. So what I'm suggesting is this, that you notice throughout the day when you are contracted and when you are expansive, not meaning moving out, but relaxed and open. So this is where the Western hemispheric, you got to do stuff, interferes with the energetic interpretation. So the idea that you have to gather yourself will and do something feels expansive. But on some level, it is contractive. It requires contracted forces to move ahead like that. This is an example of paradox. The guide is very fond of paradox. Paradox means apparent contradiction. The guide very often says, here's a paradox, meaning, I know you understand things in one way, and the truth is different. And you just have to understand things differently to realize it. And so that was one of the ways I realized that I was assigning words and values opposite to what I wanted to understand, a deeper level of what I wanted to understand. So if you think of reality like a braid that switches back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, it's not a direct path. But as you develop and understand and develop and understand, it requires different interpretations of reality, different perceptions to see more. You're not giving up something, but you do have to release one view to be able to study and appreciate and understand another view. And the truth is all of it. And that's hard. It's hard to hold in our limited brain. But the mind believes it can hold truth. And what it winds up holding is the fragment that it is able to understand versus the larger truth, which is more complicated. And it hurts the mind to try to think of all these things. So, 3 stages of consciousness. The one is living in fantasy. The second is living for the sake of impressing others. Now, several people expressed that they thought, because my exercise, the exercise that the lecturer suggested and I highlight, is try this out. Start noticing hour by hour during the day where you're trying to impress others. Just notice. And that takes effort versus just being yourself and saying, I hope you can understand, or I hope this is enough for you. And several people commented that once they started to notice, they were impressing people all the time. That is true. And then you say, well, what is best? Which way should I be? We can be both. And that's what the mind has a hard time understanding. One of my favorite concepts is cognitive dissonance, psychological term for conflicting ideas that don't fit together, and it literally gives you a headache. And the mind basically says, pick one. I can't hold both. They don't fit. Pick one, throw the other one away. Spirituality is about finding the truth in both. It's not pretty. It's not clean. It's not easily verbalized. It may be difficult to express or to really hold, but two things can exist in the same place, whether you want them to or not. So, in living for the sake of impressing others, when you notice you're impressing others, that's like noticing your mask. And people say, with the mask, am I supposed to get rid of it? No. The idea is realize when you're wearing one. Now, I don't do these videos in my pajamas or my nightgown. I don't do them without my hair combed. I tidy up my area behind me. You can chalk that up to politeness, or when you have company over, of course, you clean up. You can chalk that up to vanity. I will fess up to some vanity. You can chalk it up to appropriate attire for a given situation. My point is, I know who I am, unwashed, undressed, with my hair in a mess. And I know the other part of me, and I choose to behave in a certain way to interact with, frankly, relative strangers. People can be put off by messiness or chaos, or what they consider to be a lack of care or a lack of consideration of them or a lack of social norms. And we are all brought up with that. It's not that it's bad to conform to social norms, to wear a mask. What Patrick is suggesting is that we know when we're wearing it. So as a woman, if I wore makeup, which I don't, which is another very complicated issue for some people, I need to know who I am with it and without it. And I need to be able to choose, and it needs to always be a choice. I can't, it is preferable to me to not be in a place where I cannot go out without makeup on. And yet there I am. I can't really go out without combing my hair. Take that as a mask. I'm uncomfortable going out with my hair messed up or going out in a nightgown. And I don't want to go too far down that. But what I'm trying to describe is living for the sake of impressing others is not the same as accepting certain social norms as a way that we all learn to live together and that we are all giving cues back and forth. I want to stress living for the sake of impressing others is not the same as a certain level of cooperation. But either way, it's important that you recognize right now I'm cooperating. For instance, right now I'm wearing business clothes versus when I get home, I put jeans and a t-shirt on. If I know that that's my preference, then I can accept in a given situation to behave differently. And I know that my preference is something else. Patrick is mostly concerned is when you have forgotten that it's a choice, or when you have basically you dress up for one thing and you stay in that mask, you stay in that appearance throughout your life, and you won't give yourself permission to flow back and forth between private situations, public situations, professional situations. So the idea is awareness. Awareness is key. So living in fantasy, nothing wrong with a good fantasy. People ask that question. It's like going on vacation. Go on vacation. Go on a cruise. Live like a king. Go to a foreign country where the currency rate allows you to have more luxury than you could normally afford. But to stay on vacation or to insist that that become your reality, that's a forcing current to live in fantasy rather than appreciate the temporary relaxation, refreshment, change. So moment by moment, you can go into fantasy and come back. The idea is to understand that was fantasy. This is real. The problem is when we get all our pleasure, that's why the guide's phrase, where do you get your pleasure? To get all our pleasure in fantasy leaves us not having much energy or enthusiasm about real life. So we don't do the work that real life requires. Someone mentioned James Thurber's story of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where the person spent 90% of their time in fantasy and their own life was dull and boring, lifeless. If you get all your pleasure in fantasy, then you don't have enough energy left and you're not interested in your life. Then the discrepancy becomes greater and greater so that the only pleasure you'll get is in fantasy. And your real life becomes terrifying. It's awful. It's something that needs to be avoided because you're not doing the work. It's like living in a place where you never do anything and you go out and things happen for you and you're able to do things and you come home and the sink is dirty and the floor is dirty, but you don't have any energy left to improve your own home. Therefore, you have more propensity to go out. That's why living in fantasy can become a problem. It's not only a vicious circle, it's a spiral. Living for the sake of impressing others could also be a spiral. The third stage of consciousness, the guide simply calls it the most developed, oddly enough, is called living for your own sake. Now, that is often claimed to be narcissistic and self-interested, but whose sake would you be living for? Living for your own sake means learning to live to take care of your own needs rather than somebody else's. I very, very often refer to the airline safety instruction. Put on your mask before helping someone with theirs. Now, I was a pilot for a period of time, and I did hypoxia training, high altitude training. It was a free service that the Air Force offered to private pilots. And so I went through the training, and what I learned in that training is why that announcement is made. They don't want to scare people, so they do not explain it. If there's a sudden decompression on an airplane, you have about 15 seconds of consciousness. Might be more, might be less, depending on the altitude. But at a high altitude, you'll only have enough air to remain conscious for 15 seconds. If you attempt to help someone else, you will black out, and then you won't be able to help anyone else. So what I'm suggesting is that living for your own sake is an enlightened way of then having the resources to help others. And if you don't live for your own sake and you live for someone else's, you may become so drained by the difficulty of not taking care of yourself that you will eventually not be able to live for the sake of others or help others. And so you come into a state of exhaustion. You can't rely on yourself. You have not built up your own character. You don't know your own morals and values. And you can't help others. So, like the airline says, put on your mask first so that you are fully equipped and prepared to help others, which is, of course, the goal. But to do that, you need to be healthy. So it's an enlightened self-interest that tells us to take care of our basic needs first, but also as a primary in preparation for helping others, not at the expense of others, but for the purpose of community. So the second aspect that was brought up that was fascinating to me is that there's a part of fantasy going back to the first stage of consciousness, the least developed stage of consciousness. And that is that one aspect of fantasy is projection. You may not realize you're living in fantasy, but very often what we do is we project an expectation onto others, and we might get away with it for a certain period of time, so that we project that everybody's happy, and if nobody argues with us or gives us a different reality, we may believe that. We believe our own expectations. And the way I visualize it is I visualize it as having a movie that is running in my own head, and I'm projecting it literally onto the situation at hand. And unless I see a lot of discrepancy, or unless somebody shouts or argues with me, I may feel that I'm seeing reality, when I'm only seeing my own expectation of reality. It's a very subtle version of living in fantasy. And what happens when we project onto others is the little objections we might not notice. And then somebody stands up and says, "Hey, wait a minute, who do you think I am?" Or something like that. And it's almost shocking because we don't realize what we're doing. So again, awareness. Everybody projects, I project, you project. It's okay to project. It's better if you know or have an inkling that you're projecting. You can call it, well, this is my expectation, and that might influence other people to have a similar expectation. And there is truth in that. As long as you recognize how many people are on that wavelength or willing to be on that wavelength, versus that nobody else in the room is impressed with your sense of the universe. So that's there's a lot in this lecture, Patrick Lecture 187, how to handle alternation of expansive and contractive states. I invite you to read the lectures. If you're looking for this section on 3 stages of consciousness, it's not in the beginning, it's buried in the middle. So thanks for listening.